So we're going to go ahead and get started again with our last session of the day, um, which is uh, balancing housing and farmland conservation in New Hampshire. Um, Again, as I said at the close of the last session, um, this session will be presented by myself, Jamie Pottern, Senior New England Program Manager at the American Farmland Trust, and Ellie Brown, president of the Kawasagio Community Land Trust in Warner. Ellie, my apologies, I'm not saying the name correctly. I'm sure you will correct us. And I will also be the moderator for the session. So just an overview before we get started. It's no secret um, that New Hampshire is facing a serious housing shortage and loss of agricultural land. The good news, creative solutions that address both problems exist and are ripe for exploration. I will first present about some different planning and zoning tools which can be used to provide housing and leave agricultural lands available to produce food for current and future generations. Then Jamie will highlight some data and tools, including American Farmland Trust's Farms Under Threat 2040, Choosing an Abundant Future, which shows how different land use policies, sprawl versus compact development, can lead to different outcomes for farmland preservation. Finally, Ellie will wrap us up and we'll discuss the history and role of community land trusts or CLTs in engaging with issues related to land use, housing, and common space. She will also present about the Kawasagio's Community Land Trust's work to meet community housing needs and protect agricultural lands in Warner and the greater Kearsarge region. And then we should have ample time for questions at the end. Okay, so why are we here today? We're going to try to tackle two tough issues. We're going to first talk about housing, and we're also going to talk about conservation with a focus on agricultural land preservation. And we're especially going to talk about where these two issues come together and intersect, and solutions that actually try to marry the two together. As some of you probably are aware, kind of historically, these two things, housing and land conservation, have been talked about separately, and sometimes it's presented that only one can prevail. Today, like I said, we're really going to try to turn that question on its head and start to hear kind of both about the story of housing and conservation in New Hampshire, but as well as about how some really exciting projects and possibility that have kind of come to fruition where housing and conservation can intersect and coexist together. Um, After I talk about kind of some examples in the housing space, we'll then hear from Jamie and Ellie about kind of more of the examples in the farming and land conservation space. Before I get into the detail, I do just want to briefly mention that the New Hampshire Food Alliance will be hosting its 2025 New Hampshire Food Systems statewide gathering in Loudon on May 21st. There'll be and as part of that food systems gathering, there'll be a day-long breakout session about balancing conservation, farmland conservation, and housing. The QR code for that session is on the slide. If you are interested in registering, I would suggest you do so ASAP, as the Food Alliance has graciously kept registration open through this weekend for attendees and registrants of this conference and this session to register. Should be a great event. Sorry, I'm advancing my slides and my notes on two separate screens, which is why you see me turning my head back and forth. So I then also just want to briefly mention that the New Hampshire Food Alliance recently published the first ever New Hampshire Food and Agriculture Strategic Plan, which includes 27 informational briefs on a range of topics, including land use planning, farmland conservation, access and succession, as well as home and community gardens, and soil, water, and wasted food. As well as wasted food. And again, there's a QR code there on the screen to access that. After I'm done speaking, I will put the links. You can put the links in to the chat to access those. So, all right, continuing on here. So first on the housing front. So how much housing does New Hampshire need? You may have heard that New Hampshire Housing Statewide Housing Needs Assessment, published in 2023, concluded that New Hampshire needs to build approximately or just under 60,000 new units of housing between 2020 and 2030. Um, and nearly 90,000 units by 2040 to meet current unmet demand, keep up with estimated population growth, and reach a balanced market by 2040, defined as a rental vacancy rate of 5% and an owner vacancy rate of 2%. Based on current building permit activity, which will be illustrated on the next slide, through 2023, building permit activity would have to increase by approximately 36% on an annual basis to reach these 2030 and 2040 housing needs estimates. So this next slide graph is showing, which I cannot take credit for. This comes from our friends at New Hampshire Housing. Is showing building permit activity has declined since it hit a peak in the mid 1980s when looking at data going back to 1980 from the U.S. Census Bureau's building permit survey. Most of those, the dark blue is showing the single family units. The lighter blue at the very top of the dark blue part of the bar, which is really only, let me see if I can use my laser pointer here to point it out to folks. This lighter blue is units in 2-unit structures or duplexes. The green, light green, is units in 3 and 4-unit structures, so triplexes and quadplexes. And the light orange is units in 5 or plus unit structures, or what we define as multifamily housing in New Hampshire. I do want to note that while the general trends are the same of this kind of spike or peak in the mid 1980s and then this huge drop in the late 80s, this was the savings and loans crisis for folks that were around then. I can't speak for being, I was just a youngin' in those days myself, and then a steady kind of resurgence in some level of building permitting in the late 90s into the early 2000s. We reached again an early peak in the early 2000s. This was the dot-com crash. That number of permits came back down again. We reached this kind of plateau with the recession and crash of 2008, 2009. And then we started to see this kind of number of permits start to kind of go back up a little bit again in the 2010s and early 2020s. Depending on what numbers you look at, those numbers have they did kind of plateaued again. We're kind of waiting on data, final data for 2024, but expect that number may start to go up a little bit more again. But even if it has gone up a little bit more again, again, as I said on the previous slide, we're not permitting anywhere close to the number of units that we were permitting at pre-recession levels in the early 2020s. I'll also note on this slide that as I said, the Office of Planning and Development also issues its own annual building permit survey. This data is using the Census Bureau's building permit survey. The data differs a little bit because the census uses some estimates and imputation versus OPD's data is all recorded. I just didn't have a graph like this handy using our data, but I'm sure we'll put one together going forward. And as I said, our office, OPD, did just release our annual building permit survey, again, similar to the numbers shown on this screen for 2023, showing that between 2020 and 2024, the state is on track to have permitted just shy of 25 new units of housing, which is not an insignificant amount. However, that is only approximately 75% of the new units as compared to the housing needs projections published by New Hampshire Housing that are projected needed to be permitted by the beginning of 2025 on that road to permitting and producing 60,000 more units by 2030, new units by 2030, and 90,000 new units by 2040. So now I'm going to very quickly go through a couple of different planning and zoning tools for housing through the lens of how communities can utilize innovative land use controls and other planning tools and techniques to increase opportunities for housing and incentivize infill development. So here, I'm not going to go through each of these tools in detail, but just kind of, these are all tools that we track on the Office of Planning and Development's Municipal Land Use Regulation Survey, including mixed use zoning, workforce housing, multifamily overlay districts, inclusionary zoning, density bonuses, cluster development, form-based codes, ADUs, specifically detached accessory dwelling unit ordinances that allow detached ADUs. Well, talk about ADUs a little bit more in a second. Planned unit development, transfer of development rights, and village plan alternative subdivisions. All you really need to know for this slide is that the number next to each planning tool in parentheses refers to the number of municipalities which have adopted such a tool according to data from our municipal land use regulation survey from 2023. For example, 146 communities have adopted some form of mixed use zoning. So now I'm going to really quickly touch on the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox. So in 2023, BEA and the 9 regional planning commissions worked with a consultant to develop the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox, a collection of 20 planning and zoning strategies for housing production in New Hampshire communities. The toolbox contains different strategies and development approaches and zoning tools communities can adopt to encourage housing production in their community. The tool is available in 2 different formats at nhhousingtoolbox.org. It's available as a downloadable PDF as well as an interactive website. Each tool in the toolbox includes a description of the tool, the process for adopting the tool, examples of use of the tool, and inside and outside of New Hampshire, as well as any applicable references to state statute and resources for more information about the tool. So now we're going to go through just a couple of the tools and examples that are in the toolbox. And I will, let me just put, before we keep going, my apologies for not having this ready. Let me just put that URL in the chat for folks right now to check out. Great. So the first tool I want to touch on briefly is adaptive reuse, which is taking existing buildings, typically existing non-residential buildings, and that have been typically a historic structure, and adapting it for housing, into housing. This typically requires significant public investment to deal with issues of environmental remediation and contamination, as well as building in the necessary infrastructure to make the site viable. Larger projects can benefit from mixed use combining adaptive reuse and mixed use development, as well as by right permitting instead of having to go through kind of discretionary permitting process. And RSA 79E, the Community Revitalization Tax Relief Incentive, it can also be a valuable tool to encourage investment in rehab and conversion of historic structures into housing. So now a couple of real quick examples of adaptive reuse. On the left, you were seeing a picture of a former school in the town of Temple in the Monadnock region. My apologies, I don't have the name of that school. It's been converted into 3 units of housing. And on the right, you were seeing the Jaffrey Mills, another in Jaffrey Mills in the center of the town of Jaffrey, again in the Monadnock region, which has been converted into 30 units of affordable housing. And then at the larger scale, different region of the state, here's another example of adaptive reuse of the former China Mill in the Suncook Village in Allenstown, just east of Concord, which sat vacant and underutilized for decades before being converted into the lofts at 25 Canal. And it was created, the redevelopment or reuse of the property resulted in now there's 150 apartments, which opened, I believe, in 2023. The project is right outside of Suncook Village, existing property. So the project not only added new housing stock and simultaneously preserved a historic structure for folks that have been with us all day. I believe some of our speakers on the infill development session spoke about this very example this morning. The structure itself dates back to 1868 and didn't require, so not only did they retain this beautiful historic mill building, but also didn't require the development of any or deforestation or destruction of any land or of any really any greenfield development. The next tool I'm going to touch on real briefly is ADUs, or accessory dwelling units. ADUs are at their most simplest form are secondary homes or apartments on an existing single-family lot. They can be apartments within the primary home, typically either in the basement or attic, attached to the primary home, or an accessory building above a garage or a standalone cottage. Noteworthy that RSA 674:71-73, which is where the ADU statute can be found in the state RSAs, currently only requires municipalities to allow attached ADUs, and only requires and gives municipalities a choice that they can choose to allow them by right, or subject them to a conditional use permit process from the planning board, or a special exception from the zoning board of adjustment. I don't think I have examples there, but ADUs can be a really great, thinking about farmland conservation housing could be a great example of how to do, you're not doing a lot of density, but you're getting a couple housing units, an additional ADU on a parcel with a single family home that might also have a farm. Could be a good solution in some instances. The next example I want to touch on is cluster housing. Cluster housing, conservation subdivisions, and open space development ordinances all create opportunities for the creation of housing while preserving significant amounts of land for agriculture, recreation, or conservation. Again, going back to the earlier survey I referred to, the OPD's Municipal Land Use Regulation Survey, which I will put the link to in the chat, which is chock full of data. 179 municipalities have include and unincorporated places with zoning authority. So that includes Coas County, which has zoning authority over the 23 unincorporated places in Coas County. 179 jurisdictions have a cluster housing or open space type ordinance. That's over, actually, I believe close to like 2/3 or 70% of jurisdictions with zoning authority in the state have a cluster housing subdivision ordinance. We don't have time to go into kind of the weeds today on cluster housing ordinances. I will say it is one of the planning tools that is the most prevalently adopted by municipalities throughout the state. That said, it's also one of those tools that I would argue is underutilized because some municipalities, may have very well intentionally drafted or created a conservation subdivision ordinance. And at its time, for whatever reason, placed a certain kind of minimum acreage, say 20 acres, that a applicant has to have under site control in order to do a conservation subdivision. And other requirements like that, which just unfortunately make it harder to do, make some of these communities that have conservation subdivision ordinances on the books just not more frequently used. There is no requirement typically that a conservation or cluster housing development or conservation subdivision has a conservation easement or a deed restriction to protect the open space from development. In fact, it's pretty likely that the open space in a conservation subdivision or cluster housing development is protected by deed rider or deed restriction, but this isn't always the case, as typically open space and a conservation subdivision is in common ownership, and each homeowner in the HOA owns a percentage of it. In these cases, like I said, when it is owned when that common space is owned in common ownership by the HOA and by each owner within the HOA, it's unlikely that it would be covered by a conservation easement. Um, Not always the case. There are cases I think where that could, you could have the two, but that is it's kind of more of a issue in the weeds for if we were to do a session just on conservation subdivisions. But again, this can be a great tool, again, for marrying housing and conservation. There aren't a ton of examples of farmland conservation housing using cluster housing and conservation subdivision ordinances, but it's not to say it can't be done. The next tool I want to touch on real quickly is the transfer of development rights, or TDR, which are policies allowing landowners to sell development capacity, thus focusing housing in the areas where adequate infrastructure exists, usually between rural sending zones and developed receiving zones, although careful calibration of the system, administrative capacity, and predictable permitting practices are necessary. As a result, really the only community that has really figured out how to crack the nut on TDR in New Hampshire and operate a successful TDR program to date is the city of Dover on the seacoast, which has used TDR to conserve and protect land west of the Spalding Turnpike while allowing increased density of housing east of the Spalding Turnpike, including the cottages at Back River Road, developed by John and Maggie Randolph, which contains 44 tiny homes rented at fair market rents. And through Dover's TDR program, the cottages was able to build at a higher density while conserving several acres of land than they would have been able to do if they were just building a conventional single-family home subdivision. So I got one or two more tools here, and then I'll turn it over to Jamie. Next tool is missing middle housing types. Missing middle housing types include a range of dwellings that are between larger single-family homes and larger apartment buildings. They're quite common in many older communities and downtowns, and are often not allowed by zoning rules for new construction. They can be a great housing type to consider in rural areas, again, with small towns or village centers. And here's just a couple of examples of residential conversions. These are existing homes that have been converted. Single-family homes were converted into duplexes, or it looks like in this case, I'm not quite sure how many units. Again, I borrowed some of these pictures from our friends at New Hampshire Housing, but these are a couple of duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes that have been converted from single-family homes in the town of Exeter. Again, you're retaining the historic structure. They would fit in, I think, very well on a kind of some of our more kind of historic rural landscapes, especially when we're thinking about trying to marry farmland conservation and housing together. And then finally, kind of thinking bigger picture, a couple of examples of projects that try to marry these two ideas together. So on the left portion of your screen is an aerial image of close-up of the homes at the Newbanoosa neighborhood in Peterborough, which I want to say was built sometime in the mid 90s. The Newbanoosa neighborhood and farm is an intentional community and co-housing development and a conservation subdivision in Peterborough. The 113-acre neighborhood includes 29 environmental sensitive farm-style homes clustered around a working farm and common indoor and outdoor spaces. The development was enabled by zoning changes by the town of Peterborough. It includes single families, duplexes, and fourplexes. In the middle portion of the screen is the Terrell Farm condominiums in Nashua. Until the 21st century, the Terrell Homestead was an 8th generation dairy farm on 74 acres in southeast Nashua. In 2011. The family sold most of the properties to the city for permanent conservation. And then in 2019, 25 acres were sold to Etchstone Properties for development under the city's conservation subdivision rules. And as a result of that was 25 new 3-bedroom single-family homes of less than 2,000 square foot each. And the development also includes 3 conserved areas with wetlands, hayfields, and nature trails that connect to other parks. And the image above the site plan of the Terrell Farm condominiums is what a home looks like there. The homes are sold as condos, condominiums with land held by a nonprofit condominium association. Finally, on the right of your screen is the proposed plan for Jacobson Farm in Amherst, which is still currently undergoing subdivision review by the Amherst Planning Board. The project did receive approval for a conditional use permit for a planned residential development under the now rescinded Integrative Innovative Housing Ordinance in Amherst in September 2023. Currently, the project is being looked at for about, they're still making adjustments for about approximately 33 single-family home lots, one lot with a 4-unit barn, one lot restricted to farming, and 2 open space lots. There are also currently 5 units of proposed workforce housing with a possible potential for a 6th unit to be added. That is that. And here's my contact information for anybody that doesn't already know how to reach me. And now I will turn it over to Jamie.
Great, thanks, Noah. Okay, I'm taking control. I'm just gonna change my view here. Okay, I've got the power. All right, can you hear me?
I can. You're in business.
All right. Great. Well, thanks so much for having me at this conference. I know it's a long day and a lot for folks to give up their Saturday to do some additional learning. So just want to express my gratitude for being invited to come talk to you guys about farmland protection and for your interest. So as Noah said, my name is Jamie Pottern. I'm the Senior New England Program Manager at American Farmland Trust. I've been with AFT about 6 years, but I have over a dozen years of experience in the farmland conservation field. But I also have a planning background, and I did previously serve on my town's planning board for 7 years. So I can relate to many of you planners here on the call. So as Noah said, I'm here to kind of give the counterpoint around some of the farmland trends and issues kind of at a high level in New England as well as right here in New Hampshire. In case you don't know what American Farmland Trust is, you may have seen our bumper sticker, no farms, no food, but a little bit more about who we are. We're a national agricultural land trust. We were founded in 1980, and we work to save the land that sustains us by protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. We have over 250 staff nationally and around 30 right here, boots on the ground in New England. And we do a variety of work from direct technical assistance to farmers around regenerative agriculture, to policy work, to building capacity for land protection, as well as research and advocacy. And that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about today is, again, providing just some statistics from our Farms Under Threat study, which is really a series of research reports that we did nationally to really empower communities and planners like yourselves to have the data around more of the threats to farmland. So the data sets I'm going to be using include our State of the States study, which looked at a 15-year period from 2001 to 2016 and looked at different farmland conversion trends across all 50 states. Our most recent study, the 2040 study, projected those same trends out to the year 2040 under different development scenarios. And then thirdly was a report I actually co-authored that pulled out of that first State of the State study, pulled the data from the 6 New England states to try to present sort of a holistic view of some of the threats and opportunities and what we can do about it right here in New England. So kind of zooming out, what did we find from some of this data? Well, as you guys probably know, we don't have as much farmland as other parts of the country, but unfortunately, we're losing a disproportionate or a higher percentage of the farmland that we do have left. And in the 2040 study, unfortunately, those trends seem to be holding true. We're losing a much higher percentage of our farmland than other parts of the country. I think really interesting, particularly for you planners on the call, is what our Farms Under Threat study did, I think kind of uniquely, was it identified different kinds of conversion that were happening across the country. So before this study, my understanding is, we would look at a map and we would see, okay, something was a farm at the start of a study, and at the end of the study, it was no longer a farm, right? It had become a housing development or commercial development or a parking lot. What our more refined study did, based on very smart GIS analysts, were able to do a more refined look at what we call low density residential development. And you guys are probably quite familiar with this kind of development in New Hampshire, and we'll talk more about it. But the way I think about it is more of that kind of slow burn around existing farmland that's kind of getting chewed up by residential development. And perhaps it's still a farm, perhaps it becomes a smaller farm, but essentially over time, that type of development can make that farm less viable over time and much more likely to transition fully out of agriculture. So zooming right into New Hampshire, what did we find? From 2001 to 2016, we saw that New Hampshire lost nearly 12,000 acres of agricultural land. And while 40% of that, 4,600 acres, was that total kind of loss, that urban and highly developed kind of development, 60% of it was to that low density residential development. And why that's so significant, if you look at the left-hand corner there, is land that was in LDR in 2001 was 6 times more likely to be completely converted out of agriculture at the end of that 15-year period. So it's really this sort of catalytic multiplier effect where it's creating more of a threat to farmland once it's in this type of development. And unfortunately, New Hampshire ranks 7th nationally in terms of the percentage of its ag land projected to be converted. Under a business as usual scenario, that's about 8.3% of New Hampshire's ag land. And what does that look like? That's over 35,000 acres of New Hampshire's farmland projected to be lost by 2040. 60% of that will occur on your state's best ag land. And that's the equivalent of 1,400 farms, $16 million in farm output, and about 1,200 jobs, with the hardest hit counties being Hillsborough, Rockingham, and Grafton. This data can also be drilled down to the county level, which I think might also be particularly interesting for planners here on the call, whether you're at a regional planning commission or you serve one town, but you can really drill down, and I think it's pretty interesting. I just pulled Strafford County as an example, which is projected to lose at least 2,800 acres of ag land. But you can also see the breakdown there between that UHD type of development and the low density residential type of development. And again, unfortunately, in the 2040 study, we're projecting that land that's in LDR, that was in LDR in 2016, is going to be 3 times more likely to be converted out of agriculture by 2040. And a brief aside, our data analysts are really seeing that our data may have been underreported, that we may have underprojected the amount of farmland we're likely to lose, unfortunately. And this is significant, of course, because New Hampshire only has so much farmland to lose, right? We only have about 3,200 acres of agricultural land left. And as all of you know, where are we most likely to put development? Well, we're most likely to put it on cleared, open agricultural land. And so this really begs the question of, what are the different futures that are out there? We could be losing less farmland and we could be losing more farmland. And so really our pitch, of course, because we're American Farmland Trust, is we hope communities will really lean into what we call this better built cities, or in the case of New Hampshire, mostly better built towns, in which policymakers, land use planners like yourselves, land trusts, and other organizations are really working to promote more of that compact development. A lot of the tools that Noah was just talking about, so that we can be reducing sprawl, saving irreplaceable farmland from conversion. We have the tools at our disposal. It's just a matter of really ramping up the pace and making creative decisions about how we're gonna move forward into the future. Just a little bit more context, we are known here in New England for having a really stellar track record for protecting our farmland, and all of that is true. But even given all the work we've done in the last 50 years, only about 12.5% of all of New England's agricultural land is permanently protected, which leaves the vast majority really vulnerable to potentially going out of production. And really, asks us all to think about what are the other tools in the toolbox, in addition to conservation, that we can be employing to really stave off the loss of this farmland. I won't go into all the other compounding threats to farmland loss, but I'll just pull a few here, which is the fact that we have a really aging farmer population, particularly in New Hampshire. A third of farmers are over the age of 65, and we know that many of them don't have successors lined up after them to take over these farms. On the other side of that, we know that the next generation of farmers are eager to get onto these farms, but they really struggle to afford the high cost of land and housing. And that's really preventing so many folks, again, from taking over these farms. And we see that in New Hampshire, farm real estate values are up over 5% just over last year. I want to just remind folks and offer that these data are available to you. They were created to be used by stakeholders like yourselves. So just to uplift a few examples, the Massachusetts Farmland Action Plan is our statewide action plan that was produced about a year and a half ago. And it has incorporated some of this farms under threat data. And I was excited to see the New Hampshire State Brief, New England Feeding New England report had also incorporated some of these farms under threat data. So I'll drop links into the chat once I'm done speaking, but just want to offer that to all of you. Okay, so kind of pulling all this together, what does this really mean for the New Hampshire conservation community and as well the planning community, most of whom I'm assuming is on this call? So of course, the first imperative is to figure out how we can conserve as much of the remaining ag land base as possible so we can protect New Hampshire's food supply and our food security. But we also need to figure out how to protect farmland in ways that thoughtfully incorporate farmer housing and affordability, because as we know, farmers need housing and they are really struggling right now to afford that housing and stay in their communities. And thirdly, we really collectively as a conservation and I would say municipal community really stretch our thinking and relationships to figure out how to collaborate more on projects and policies that can address both conservation and affordable housing. These issues are often pitted against each other. And really, as I hope to show in some of these upcoming examples I'm about to share, they can really go hand in hand and have some win-win-win kinds of solutions. So first, I just want to share a few tools that are tools that already exist in the conservation land trust space within our existing toolbox, tools that address housing access and affordability. So first is tools that we can include in our existing conservation easement tool. As many of you know, these are permanent easements that are forever. Landowners sell their development rights. And retain the right to do farming and forestry and those kinds of things. But you can also include added tools. And one such tool is called the option to purchase at agricultural value. This is a mechanism that ensures that all future buyers of that farm must be a qualified farmer, and these farms must transfer at an agricultural value. Other tools that can get included in conservation easements include farmer housing requirements or things like limits on resale value. Again, trying to keep the cost of these protected farms down and ensure that they try to get into the hands of farmers and also think about housing and affordability. The next example, which Ellie's going to talk about in much more detail, so I'll just mention it, because it's a tool that I think more conservation land trusts have been using in recent years, is the community land trust model with the 99-year ground lease. And this is a case where a town or a land trust could step in, purchase a property, and lease back the underlying land to a farmer. Farmer retains ownership of the buildings. And the lease is really the mechanism that can have some perpetual affordability provisions and equity building mechanisms within that lease language. And it's also a great tool because a lease is something you can amend as opposed to a conservation easement, which is forever. So that is a benefit. I'll also mention a tool that many more communities are using is called the buy, protect, sell kind of a mechanism where a town or a land trust could step in and buy a vulnerable farm that comes up on the market. They can work, again, to conserve it with a permanent easement and then sell that property subject to that easement at a reduced rate to a farmer. or could lease that property, lease or license that property. And then lastly, again, towns often own or acquire farmland through tax taking, or land trusts receive it in somebody's will. These might just be properties that are on the books. And so you can really evaluate the land base that you have as an entity. That land might also come with agricultural buildings and structures that a farmer might really want access to. And so those can be considered to be made available via lease or sale to a farmer within your community. So I'm going to quickly share an example of an option to purchase at Ag Value project. This was a project I was actually involved with over 10 years ago. It was the first option to purchase at Ag Value, or OPAV project, in the state of New Hampshire. It was pretty tricky to pull together the first one, but our powers combined with all the partners, we were able to pull it off. And the way this project went was, it was a third generation family farm. The younger generation was trying to buy out the elder generation, but the value of that conservation easement really wasn't sufficient to make the finances work. And so we were able to include an OPAV inside of the conservation easement. What that did is it increased the value of that conservation easement, and it enabled more of the finances to work, enabled them to kind of buy out that senior generation. And it also gave them the peace of mind that whatever happens in the future, if they ever have to sell the property outside of the family, the OPAV will ensure that this property, this protected farm, will always stay in the hands of farmers and be more affordable to future farmers, because it has to transfer at an agricultural value. We also use some whole farm mechanisms, deed restriction, to tie the house to the land so that they will never be separated from each other. Okay. So now I'm going to go into sort of the case for, unique housing and conservation partnerships. And so this is really something I've been seeing around New England and nationally at various land conservation conferences I've been at, is that I feel like there's a growing awareness and interest from the land trust community and how they can be more engaged and involved in addressing the affordable housing crisis. And I think increasingly seeing that instead of, again, affordable housing and conservation being pitted against each other, fighting for the same piece of land, that in fact our values are quite aligned, that we should have protected open space and everybody should have access to safe, affordable homes with ready access to green spaces. And we can have projects that end up even better than they might have been had they just been more standalone kinds of projects. So I'm going to share two quick examples before I hand it off to Ellie. So the first is an example from Western Massachusetts that was done by the Kestrel Land Trust, which is a regional land trust based in Amherst, Massachusetts. This was a project where they really, as an organization, decided that while they had protected many kinds of land over their 40 years, farmland, forest land, wetlands, and done a lot of sort of community conservation type projects, they had never done a project that involved affordable housing. And so they actually sought out an affordable housing partner, a developer, to come together and figure out, find a parcel and figure out how to do this together. And so they actually identified this parcel, and the community builders, affordable housing developer, actually had an adjacent parcel next to this one that was for sale. And so they worked together and had a lot of really, I think, wonderful outcomes where they were able to protect the majority of the land with a conservation easement. They were able to leverage the value of the frontage there, again, for the affordable housing developer to step in and bring their respective affordable housing sources to the table. The conservation community was able to bring their grants and funding sources to the table, and their powers combined, they were able to make the finances of the project work, where they were able to meet the value that the seller really needed to make the project work for them. The project is still in the permitting process, but at the end of the day, it will have nearly 90 new units that are affordable units, and again, will create access to protected open space for those residents. So I think a very cool and exciting project. The next example I'm going to share is one that I think will excite the planners on this call. It excited me, but I think it's a really different approach to this kind of a project. So this comes out of the Hudson Valley in New York, a collaboration called the Hudson Valley Alliance for Housing and Conservation. So this is a group of over 14 Hudson Valley organizations who are working together to strengthen both their biodiversity and climate resilience goals while also creating affordable places for people to live. So they meet monthly, they work to build relationships and trust and share information across their two sectors. They've developed things like a shared purpose statement to encapsulate their values and goals that bind them together in this work. They have a shared list of public policy ideas. And I think most interesting to this group is that they created a very cool GIS-based map of places they think may be well-suited to collaborative projects between affordable housing groups and conservation groups. So you can go check out the map on their website. You can zoom in. You can kind of learn about the process and how they came up with this map. But I just think it's a very, very cool approach and one that New Hampshire planners might consider employing to think about these kinds of projects together and think about it in a new way. And most exciting to me is that the first project has just come out of this initiative. It's called the Red Hook Gateway Project. And it's a collaborative effort that involves their affordable housing organization, the town, and a few land trust partners. And they were able to come together to conserve about 100 acres of farmland while transforming 12 acres into a hub of affordable housing, commercial space, and creating job opportunities, and creating up to 40 cutting-edge new energy efficient homes. So super cool project. I was excited to find out about it. And again, I'll drop these links into the chat after. One last resource I'll leave you with before I hand it off to Ellie is my dear colleague, Julia Friedgood, who's a senior advisor with American Farmland Trust and really one of our champions of planning for agriculture, recently came out with this really wonderful book called Planning Sustainable and Resilient Food Systems. It's got all kinds of great case studies and examples, including some from around New England that uplift different ways to think about planning for agriculture. We also have some great planning for ag resources on our website, and I will drop those links into the chat. And these are other links that I know Noah's going to send around all these slides, but these are kind of some links I pulled together that I thought had some pretty cool examples of conservation and housing folks working together, and already compiled them so that you guys don't have to. So that's it for me. And now I'm really excited to hand it off to Ellie. Take it away, Ellie.
Great. Right. Can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah,
okay.
We can hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not seeing the camera option, but that's okay.
That's fine.
All right. So my name is Ellie Brown. I live up in Warner, New Hampshire, and I am one of the co-founders and the president of the Kawasiwadzo Community Land Trust, or KCLT. And I'm going to give sort of a general overview of what community land trusts are, and then spend the bulk of the time focused on what we're doing with KCLT here in the Kearsarge region. So a little bit about community land trusts. They are rooted here in the United States in the Civil Rights Movement. One of the first community land trusts was developed in Georgia in the 1960s to give access to farmland to Black farmers. Most of them are focused on providing housing and access to land in perpetuity. There are over 250, actually now I think closer to 300 community land trusts nationwide. Community land trusts are democratically governed nonprofit organizations and generally have a split of board structure where a third of the members are lessees or residents of buildings or lands that are governed by the community land trust. A third are general members, and a third are public representatives or experts in a certain field. And in that way, there's really a whole lot of community control over the projects that are being worked on through the community land trust. They acquire land or buildings or both to meet various community needs. The Community Land Trust generally owns the land, and then the building is split off from the land and can either be rented or bought by an individual or family. And there are formulas built in so that owners of buildings are able to gain equity as well through their ownership of that home. As well as resale restrictions to ensure affordability for future purchases. So that would be built into the deed, and there are a whole bunch of different resale formulas to determine how that home is eventually sold in the future. Next one. So little diagram. So the Community Land Trust, again, the building is owned by an individual, could also be a commercial building, not just residential. And then that is split from the land. That land is owned by the Community Land Trust, which is governed by the board. In terms of gaining access to the land, as was said previously, for generally for farmland use, a 99-year ground lease would be put in place between the Community Land Trust and the farmer, ensuring access in perpetuity for that farmer. Right. And so our organization, the Kawasiwadzo Community Land Trust, or KCLT, was developed out of initial conversations that started in February of 2020, right before COVID. So in some ways, not great timing, but in other ways, kind of excellent timing. I feel like housing was really at the forefront of a lot of people's minds during that year, and especially the lack of affordable housing. And there was a group of community members in the Kearsarge region, and specifically in the Warner area, that we really saw the need for increased housing affordability. A lot of us, including myself, were struggling to find housing, and really saw a gap in what was being offered and available in our area. There you go. So this is a view from the top of Kearsarge, looking down towards Warner. So we're in quite a rural area, even though we're only about 15 minutes from Concord in the capital region. And the surrounding towns are similar as well. Our name, Kawasiwadzo, comes from the Abenaki language. We worked with some local members of Abenaki tribe here in New Hampshire, as well as in Vermont. And they were very supportive of us using this name. There was a lot of discussion around whether we should use an Indigenous name for our organization, but eventually settled on this name. And it means Windfall Mountain. It's the name of Mount Kearsarge. Our service area is the 7-town school district, Kearsarge School District region of Bradford, Newbury, New London, Sutton, Springfield, Warner, and Wilmette. Currently, we're focused primarily in Warner, but are interested in expanding out into other towns as we grow.
Sorry about that, everybody. Keeping you on your feet there. You still there, Ellie? Can you hear us, Ellie?
Yeah, sorry, it cut out and disappeared. I had to log back in.
Okay, and I just reloaded it, so you should be able to. Let me know if you need me to advance slides or if you're good.
I think we are good. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
There we go. So the mission of KCLT is to create resilience and connection in the Kearsarge community through the intersection of land and housing. So we really see the importance of viewing the needs for housing and land as inherently linked and are driven by the desire to build communities that are rooted in place, and especially where people who make their livelihoods off the land are able to live where they work. Some of our values, we are community-led. So again, our board is composed of local residents and stakeholders. And one of the long-term goals of the organization is to bring more agency to our communities regarding housing and land use issues. We want to maintain a rural character of place. So we strive to create and maintain housing that fits the character of our rural towns by restoring existing buildings, choosing appropriately scaled projects, and supporting land-based livelihoods, and also focusing on stability and equity within the work that we're doing. So providing access to safe, secure, long-term housing in an equitable way, while also creating ways for homeowners and tenants to build equity in their homes. A lot of affordable housing and workforce housing is focused on a rental model, and the terms of affordability often expire after a certain number of years. So while there's certainly a place for this sort of housing with the community land trust model, we're working to create housing that remains permanently affordable through a model where residents are able to own their own home outright or through a long-term renewable lease. So going into our first pilot project, it's called the Foster Farm, which is a little confusing. It's not actually an active farm at the moment. It used to be. It was one of the first European settlements in the Warner area. It's located at the edge of the Mink Hills in Warner. You can see the red pin there. It's about 2 miles outside of town. The property is a little over 70 acres of forest, wetland, and open space, with a really quite a large wetland complex there in the center of the property, and was built in the early 1800s. In October of 2020, so in our first year of the organization, we weren't actually officially a nonprofit at this point. We were still in the forming stages, but someone connected to the work we were doing purchased the property with the intent of working with us over the next few years for KCLT to take ownership and have this property jumpstart our work in the region. And since the purchase, a whole lot of cleaning and repairs have been done by KCLT board members, volunteers, and the current owner to restore the historic property. A new roof was put in, septic system insulation, a bunch of window restoration was done, exterior painting, interior painting, plaster work, as well as a whole lot of cleanup of vehicles and other debris on the land. So have some pictures of what it looked like before we started working on it. It was in pretty rough shape. Just go through a few of these. That was the old barn, library. These are some historic photos of what it used to look like. And then this is currently, the picture on the right there is what it looks like now. And this is a little fire pond sort of next to the building. And behind there, the building with the green roof is an old horse barn, and then there's some open pasture space beyond that as well. In our vision for Foster Farm with the Community Land Trust, we're envisioning this as our first project of hopefully many within the region. And specifically for Foster Farm, our focus will be on stable and affordable housing. So the farmhouse will remain in use as housing. We hope to add potentially an additional unit within the current footprint of the home, turning a small portion of it into an accessory dwelling unit. We would sell the house to an income qualified buyer and then work with a 99-year ground lease for land use and have a resale restriction to keep the house affordable if whoever buys it decides to sell in the future. We're also going to focus on land conservation through a conservation easement on a portion of the property, specifically on the sensitive wetland complex and forest habitat, and that is land that is amongst the highest conservation priority in Warner. and would add a central link to a corridor of conserved lands across the Mink Hills. Indigenous land use access, we are planning to work on a cultural easement with Abenaki partners in the region, which would provide access in perpetuity to Indigenous peoples for the purposes of harvesting culturally relevant natural resources, gathering for spiritual or cultural purposes, and other uses as determined through conversations with relevant parties. And then lastly, farmland access. So we plan to go through an RFP process to find a farmer or farming family who would be interested in stewarding a portion of the property while revitalizing the land and potentially rebuilding the old barn. And ideally, that person, whoever is farming the land, would also be the person who is living in the house. That doesn't have to be the way that it works, but that would be the ideal situation that we would be looking at. We are currently raising funds to purchase the property. The owner is very generously working with us on a 4-for-1 bargain deal. So we have the goal of raising $160,000, which is a quarter of the appraised value, raising those funds by the end of 2025. And then after Foster Farm, some future possible projects that we've thought about. And a lot of these are things that both Noah and Jamie talked about previously in terms of sort of unique housing structures for affordable housing, looking at potentially doing cluster conservation development if there is a location within our district that makes sense. Working on multifamily conversions. So there are a lot of single family homes where maybe there's just an individual or a couple living in the house. A lot of people are aging and maybe their house is getting too big for them and they want to downsize, but they aren't able to afford to downsize. And so by turning their home into a duplex or more units, they're able to age in place, have a lower cost of living, and then also increase the amount of affordable housing that is available in the area. And with something like that, the Community Land Trust would purchase the land and the building would be split, and each party would own their individual side of that. So similar to like a condo structure, but just slightly different. Looking at accessory dwelling units and how we can support the creation of those throughout the region. Working on infill development within towns where development is already occurring, not increasing rural sprawl, and also taking advantage of existing municipal infrastructure such as water and sewer and roads. And then also land access for farming. So apart from just the housing portion of our mission, we are really interested in helping to support new and beginning farmers in getting access to land in the region, and hopefully pairing that with housing for them as well, because that is often a struggle for farmers. Is you might be able to find land somewhere, but if your house is not near there, it makes it really difficult to actually steward that land. And not just land for farming, but also other land-based livelihoods, forestry, other careers as well that are really dependent on the land. And yeah, so we, I guess not quite getting to this yet, but KCLT really sees ourselves as part of an interconnected solution to the current housing crisis, and we plan to support our community's needs for housing while also strengthening our local economy, being mindful of excessive growth and rural sprawl, helping those that live here stay in their homes, and securing long-term land access for farming. And ways, if you're interested in getting involved or staying in touch with what we're doing, we're always looking for volunteers and or donations. We currently, or soon, will be growing our board, if that is something you're interested in or know of someone who might be, as well as a variety of different subcommittees. we're working to expand our partnerships with other organizations in the area. We've been talking with some of the local regional land trusts about establishing ongoing partnerships with them, which is really exciting to be working on. And also always open to project ideas, advice, support, etc. We're a relatively young organization. Our board is fully volunteer run. And so we're always looking for other partners to connect with in the work that we're doing. And then my information is there if you want to email or learn more about what we're doing, as well as our website. And I think that about wraps it up.
Great. Well, thank you. Do I need to take control back? I'm going to thank Jamie and Ellie so much. We do have about 10 minutes left before the end of today's session and conference. If folks do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Don't think I saw any so far. This is just the last slide. So yeah, folks do have some questions. We do have a couple minutes.
I'll also go ahead and drop, Noah, I'll drop some of those links I mentioned in the chat in case people want them. Yeah.
Perfect. And I'm going to drop also in the chat. I did drop the housing toolbox, and I think I dropped, let me check. I thought I dropped the OPD Municipal Land Use Regulation Survey. I've also dropped the Food Alliance's Food and Agriculture Strategic Plan and the link to register for the statewide gathering. I feel like we may have gotten a question here. Well, hold on. Nope. Just lots of links.
I want to say thank you for having me on. No, I learned a lot from you, and Ellie, I put it in the chat, but I just think it's such an inspiring example and amazing that you guys have just formed back in 2020 and you've already done such incredible work. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. It's likewise. Oh, there we go. We got a question. Perfect.
Colleen.
From Colleen. Great. Thank you. For any of the presenters, planners, or municipalities on the call, what is your biggest barrier to employing some of these land use strategies? Jamie, do you want to field that? You want to take that one
I'll
first?
I'll share one. Well, this is not with my land conservation hat on, but from a former volunteer planning board member hat on. And maybe I said this to you, Noah, when we were chatting the other day, but I think it's so hard for volunteer planning board members to have the bandwidth to figure a lot of this stuff out and be innovative. And so I think, you know, for planners on the call to be able to see that these tools already exist, that certain communities have already adopted them, and like be able to reach out and talk to that town and how it's working, and just be able to take that model, you know, that model tool and bring it to their own planning board. I mean, I think planning board folks really need help. They're understaffed. Often they can't even have a quorum. They have day jobs. And so just to say, like, I think these case studies are so valuable, because here in New England, where we have home rule, as we all know on this call, I mean, things just happen at the local level. We can't do as effective regional planning in the way that other parts of the country have been able to. And some of our farms under threat data sort of talk about that, how other states out in Washington State and other places, they're able to do kind of more strategic, large-scale regional planning in a way that we are sort of challenged with, because we have to do it so locally. And so it really puts the onus on our small communities to figure this out. And so the more that regional planning agencies and land trusts and other folks can be empowering communities with these kinds of examples, I think it will really help our all-volunteer boards figure out how to bring these to a vote and get them adopted.
Awesome. I think it great answer. Thank you, Jamie. Um, Sorry, I'm just busy trying to simultaneously put links in the
That's
chat.
okay. I can field the question. I see
Please.
Beth C has asked, has there been any interest in building housing on public school campuses in New Hampshire?
Huh. That is a really interesting question, Beth. I would have to follow up with you on that one. I do not have a good answer, other than to say that there is some interplay between obviously schools are government considered like government land uses. So there's some exemption from zoning requirements for schools. So it'll be interesting interplay between that and kind of restriction on them as educational institutions and housing. Again, I'd have to do some more research of how that would fit into the current kind of planning and zoning statutes in New Hampshire.
I did just see today, I didn't read the whole article, but that Plymouth State is looking at converting
you know what?
some dorm space into housing.
You're absolutely right, Ellie. I saw that article too. So that is absolutely right. I was more thinking of kind of on the municipal level, but you are right. There are Plymouth State is taking some some existing houses and dormitories that they have for student housing, and due to their declining enrollment, have plans to convert that into workforce housing, which is really really neat to see. I will actually let me say I had that article up earlier. It was in Business New Hampshire magazine. So thank you for pointing that out. Did we have another question, or was that it? Oh.
That's all I've seen. In case you or Ellie want to answer Colleen's good question about the biggest barrier to employing some of these land use strategies.
So from my perspective, I think the biggest barrier is just getting out of our comfort zone. And Jamie, I think we talked about this a little bit, and just getting out of our comfort zone of thinking about these issues and kind of our silos of just housing versus conservation. And sometimes intentionally or not working at odds with each other.
Absolutely. We see that a lot in Massachusetts, where I live. We have the Community Preservation Act, which can be used for, open space, affordable housing and historic preservation. And often, there's sort of a battle for these funds. Well, it should go to conservation or it should go to housing. And I think the example I shared in East Hampton, Massachusetts, was one where they were able to use the CPA dollars for the housing, and then they were able to get other, state funding for the conservation element of the project. And it's like, if you work together, then you're not in as much competition, right?
Yep.
And something that Mark Walmsley did share with me, who's the conservation director at Kestrel Land Trust, who did that project. I had no involvement with it, but something that they found when they were looking at potential places to do a kind of project like this was that the town's housing plan and the town's open space and recreation plan had identified a lot of the same properties, right? So one could take that and say, well, we've got to rush to put housing on this, or we've got to rush to conserve it. Or instead you can say, oh, well, this is actually the perfect parcel in which we could do a collaborative project. And I think that was really the approach that they took in the Hudson Valley example, where they kind of put their heads together and said, we can do this better together in certain cases.
Cool. Well, we're just about at time. I did put a couple more links in the chat. I'll give one last call for questions. I think there's been a great conversation. For folks that are still with us, I do just want to note that all sessions, went too far. All sessions will be have been recorded today, and they should be available next week or sometime by mid-May. So people will be on the lookout. We'll notify everybody when they're all recordings of each session are available on our webpage. We do also encourage folks to complete the anonymous conference feedback survey linked here. We'll also, again, send out more on the follow-up email to all registrants today. And well, first, again, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Ellie, for participating in today's session and staying till the end. Thank you, attendees who are still here. Yeah, we hope you have a great afternoon. Rest of your rest of your day. And for all the mothers in attendance, we hope you have a great, happy Mother's Day tomorrow. And with that, take care, all.
Thanks, folks. Thanks for pulling this together, Noah. Nice to meet you, Ellie. Bye.